barracks were silent except for the sound of boots scuffing the concrete floor and the low hum of an air conditioner fighting the heat. Private Emily Thompson stood at the front of the room, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, feeling every set of eyes burning into her. She had never felt more out of place in her life. Her uniform didn't fit quite right, the sleeves too long, the boots too tight. She could already hear the whispers. Another wannabe, a civilian, out of her league. But it wasn't until Sergeant Miller stepped into the room that everything changed. "Private Thompson." His voice cut through the air like a whip, deep and cold. "You think you're ready for this, huh? Ready to be a soldier?" The words hit like a punch to the gut. She hadn't even spoken yet. Miller, a hulking figure with a buzz cut and tattoos crawling up his neck, sized her up with an arrogant smirk. "I don't think you even know how to lace your boots right, do you?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Her mouth went dry. She glanced at the others, hoping for some support, but all she saw were smirks, eyes full of judgment. It wasn't just Miller. Half the room was already writing her off. Weak, soft, civilian. She felt the sting of their looks. She stood straighter, tightening her grip on her duffel bag. But inside, the shame was already starting to settle in, like a weight she couldn't shake. "I'll tell you what," Miller went on, pacing in front of her. "This isn't some daycare. You want to play soldier? You'll have to prove it, every damn day, and you're going to have to prove it to me first." The others laughed. The sound of it twisted like a knife. She felt her face flush, her ears hot with the embarrassment of it all. But she didn't move, didn't flinch. Not yet. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Later in the mess hall, it wasn't any better. Emily sat by herself at a corner table, her tray of food untouched as she stared down at the mess. The clatter of trays and the low murmur of conversation filled the room, but she was invisible to most of them, except for a few. A guy with a sleeve tattoo and a woman with a high ponytail were seated nearby, snickering as they watched her every move. The woman's voice floated over the sound of the chatter, loud enough for Emily to hear. "Think she'll make it past week 2? Bet she won't last through the morning drills. Can barely hold her fork right, probably can't even do a push-up." The man with the sleeve tattoo snorted. "She probably thinks this is like some reality show, huh? Gonna get a trophy for participation." Emily's hand trembled as she picked up her spoon, trying to eat, but the words still stung. She could feel their eyes on her, their laughter ringing in her ears like a dull throb. She hated this, hated how small she felt, how invisible she was, but not in the way she wanted. She wasn't a part of this, not in their eyes. She wasn't the soldier they expected, and they made sure to remind her at every chance. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. Corporal Johnson. He didn't laugh. He didn't judge. He simply sat across the room, his eyes meeting hers for just a second before he went back to his meal. It was small, but for the first time that day, Emily didn't feel entirely alone. He wasn't a loudmouth like the others, wasn't the one to make jokes at her expense. He just saw her. That was enough for now. The next morning, during morning PT, the humiliation continued. Sergeant Miller barked orders, pushing everyone to their limits. But every word felt like a blow aimed directly at Emily. He singled her out again and again, telling her she couldn't keep up, that she wasn't cut out for this. Her body burned with exhaustion. But it wasn't just the physical pain. It was the weight of their ridicule, their doubt. "Come on, Thompson," Miller yelled from behind her as she struggled through the final lap. "What's wrong with you? You're slowing down the whole squad." She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. All she could do was focus on her breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other. The sound of the other recruits' feet pounding the pavement was a constant reminder that she was behind, that she was different. But she kept going. She wouldn't stop. Not for them, not for anyone. The others were still laughing. Even when they passed her, their smirks were visible. Emily could hear the whispers, feel the eyes on her, but something inside her started to change. She pushed harder, faster, ignoring the burn in her legs, the ache in her chest. She wanted to scream, to let them all know how much they were getting to her. But instead, she focused on the rhythm of her breath, the pounding of her feet, the beat of her heart. And then, for a split second, she caught a glimpse of Corporal Johnson again. This time he wasn't looking at her with pity. He was nodding, just barely, a silent acknowledgement of something. Emily didn't know what, but it gave her a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't invisible after all. Maybe, just maybe, she could make it. By the end of the day, after another round of mockery in the barracks, Emily retreated to her bunk, her body sore and her spirit bruised. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing, her heart heavy with everything she had endured. This wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't even close. But then something else settled in. A quiet voice inside her that told her, this isn't the end. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. The rain was coming down hard, the kind of downpour that drenched you to the bone in seconds. Emily's boots splashed through the mud as she ran, the weight of her soggy clothes clinging to her skin like a heavy reminder of her place. Everyone else in the squad was ahead of her, pushing through the mud, their feet pounding the ground with rhythm and ease. Meanwhile, she was struggling to keep up, her legs burning, her breath ragged. "Pick it up, Thompson!" Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the storm, sharp and mocking. "You want to be a soldier? Then act like one." Her legs felt like lead. She tried to push herself faster, but the harder she ran, the more the mud seemed to suck her down. Every step felt like a battle, each one heavier than the last. She was so far behind that it didn't matter anymore. Everyone was leaving her behind, and the sound of their boots on the wet earth only made her feel smaller. "Maybe you should just quit now, Private," Miller yelled again. "Save us all the trouble." She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. But God, it was hard. The rain soaked her to the bone, and she couldn't even wipe the water out of her eyes. Her vision blurred, but she kept moving. She had to. She didn't know what else to do. Behind her, the rest of the squad finished their laps, the last few finishing with a cheer and a clap on the back. But no one looked back to check on her. No one except Corporal Johnson. He was always on the edge of the group, never the first to laugh at her, never the first to throw an insult. He stood there now watching her, but this time he said nothing. Just his eyes locked onto hers for a second, and then he turned, walking away without a word. That hurt more than anything Miller could have said. At least with Miller, you knew where you stood. But Johnson, he was different. She couldn't figure him out. Maybe he felt sorry for her. Maybe he just didn't want to get involved. She hated that he made her feel like she wasn't worth standing up for. The next day, Emily was barely able to get out of bed. Her muscles screamed with every move, and the exhaustion weighed down on her like a 100-pound rucksack. But she wasn't going to let it stop her. She couldn't. She dressed slowly, her fingers numb from the cold, and stepped into the chow hall with her head down. The chatter and laughter of the others filled the air, but Emily felt like she was in another world. As she grabbed her tray, she tried to avoid the usual group that made fun of her. But as always, they found her. "Well, well, if it isn't Miss I'm going to be a soldier," said the guy with the sleeve tattoo. He was sitting with the woman who had the high ponytail and a few others who always seemed to think mocking Emily was the funniest thing on earth. They laughed when she sat down at an empty table, as if it was a joke she hadn't heard 1,000 times before. She focused on her food, trying to ignore the voices, but it was impossible. They were relentless. "I heard she couldn't even do a single pull-up last week," the woman with the ponytail said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's she even doing here?" "Probably hoping the army will teach her how to look tough," the sleeve tattoo guy snickered. Emily's stomach churned. She didn't want to let them see how much it affected her, but inside it felt like they were tearing her apart piece by piece. She took a deep breath and picked up her spoon, trying to act like she didn't hear a word. It was harder than she thought. "Hey, Thompson," the guy called again, leaning over the table, his voice dripping with mockery. "You gonna eat that or just stare at it all day?" It was like they were trying to break her. Every word, every laugh was another hit. But Emily stayed silent. She kept her head down, just focusing on the food in front of her. That's when she felt it. A subtle shift in the air, as if something had changed. She looked up and saw Corporal Johnson standing by the door, his eyes scanning the room. For the briefest moment, their gazes met. He didn't smile. He didn't do anything, really. But for the first time, Emily thought maybe he was going to say something. Maybe he was going to stand up for her, but instead he just nodded once and walked away. That moment, his quiet acknowledgement, gave her just a little bit of strength. She wasn't invisible after all, but it wasn't enough to change the tide. The others kept laughing, their voices ringing in her ears, and Emily felt the sting of it all over again. Later that afternoon, during physical training, Emily pushed herself harder than ever. Every drill was like a test, and every test felt like it was designed to break her. The others were running laps, doing push-ups, and moving with the confidence of people who knew they belonged here. Emily struggled just to keep up. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, but she kept going. She had no choice. "You still here, Thompson?" Sergeant Miller's voice rang out. He was standing on the sidelines, arms crossed, watching her. "How are those push-ups coming? You gonna keep holding up the rest of the squad?" Emily's arms were shaking, but she didn't stop. She gritted her teeth, trying to push through the pain. The others were finishing their sets while she was still struggling to get through one. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to quit, but she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything they had said. She finally finished her set, barely holding herself up, but she didn't fall. She stood tall even though her legs were shaking and her body was screaming for rest. Then without a word, Corporal Johnson appeared beside her. Without even looking at her, he handed her a towel and said, "Good job, Private." His voice was low, almost like he was speaking to himself, but the words hit her like a lifeline. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, but it felt like everything. In that moment, Emily realized something. She was still here. She hadn't quit, and no matter what anyone said, she was going to keep pushing. She had to. She had no choice. The rest of the squad moved on to the next drill, but Emily stayed where she was for a moment, trying to catch her breath. As she wiped the sweat from her face, she thought about all the people who had doubted her, all the people who had written her off. And that's when she knew. The day would come when they'd regret it. She didn't know when, but she would show them. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the training ground. The sound of boots against gravel was the only thing breaking the silence as the squad assembled for the evening drill. Emily stood in line with the rest of the recruits, her uniform damp with sweat, the weight of the day's earlier exercises still settling in her bones. But this drill was different. This time, Sergeant Miller had something more special planned. "Gather round," he bellowed, his voice as sharp as ever. The others snapped to attention, eyes focused on him like soldiers trained to follow. Emily's heart pounded as she listened, her mind still racing from the last round of push-ups, the ones that had nearly sent her to the ground. "We're doing something new today," Miller continued, his voice taking on that mocking edge again. "We're going to see who's really cut out for this. You all think you're tough, huh? You think you belong here? Let's see if you can keep up when your gear's falling apart and everything's stacked against you." A murmur of confusion rippled through the group, but no one dared to speak out. Miller didn't give anyone a chance to. He motioned for the assistant instructor, a younger guy who seemed just as eager to prove himself, to bring out a crate full of training equipment. "This is the equipment failure test," Miller announced. "Each of you will have to fix a broken piece of gear under time pressure. There's one catch. If you don't fix it in time, the whole squad pays. And trust me, I'm not giving you extra time just because you're a newbie." Emily felt her stomach twist. She had barely learned how to handle the basics of her gear, and now she was being thrown into this, with no warning and no practice. She wasn't prepared. Her fingers suddenly felt too stiff, her mind too clouded with doubt. She watched as the first recruit stepped up, each of them swiftly handling their task like it was second nature. Each one of them made it look easy, and the pressure on Emily only grew. But when it was her turn, it hit her hard. The instructor handed her a broken rifle, the barrel bent in an unnatural angle. She fumbled with it, trying to remember what she'd been told in training about making quick fixes. Her hands were shaking as she worked, her mind racing through every wrong move she'd made in the past. "Come on, Thompson," Miller's voice cut through her focus. "You think you're going to waste all of our time?" The words stung like daggers. The squad's eyes were all on her, some with open disbelief, others with sneers. Emily's breath quickened as she tried to adjust the rifle. Her hand slipped. The metal clanged loudly as she dropped it, the noise echoing in the stillness. She felt their eyes on her, felt the judgment. The squad was already muttering. "Not cut out for this, huh?" The voice came from behind her. Jeff, one of the louder recruits. "Go back to your yoga class, Thompson." The laughter was almost too much to bear. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She could feel the weight of their eyes like a physical blow. Every mistake was highlighted by their ridicule. Emily bent down to grab the rifle, her fingers trembling. 5 seconds left, Miller shouted, his voice full of derision. "You better finish, or we all pay for your incompetence." With one last desperate push, Emily snapped the barrel back into place. Her heart was in her throat. Her hands were still shaking, but she managed to tighten the last screw just as Miller counted the seconds. "Time's up," he shouted, looking at her with a scowl. She didn't dare look up. The rest of the squad was already moving on, but the sneers and comments kept coming. She was the last to finish, and everyone made sure she knew it. "Nice work, Thompson," Jeff snickered. "If this were a race, you'd be dead last." Emily felt the sting of those words long after the drill ended. She'd barely held it together. The others went back to their barracks, their spirits light, while Emily stayed behind, leaning against a wall, trying to steady her breathing. That's when she heard it, a voice low but unmistakable. "You did good." Emily looked up, surprised. It was Corporal Johnson. He was standing a few feet away, his posture relaxed but firm. He didn't look like he was trying to make a scene, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet recognition. "You fixed it under pressure. That's something most wouldn't have done." She blinked, unsure of what to say. Her throat tightened, and for the first time in days, she felt like someone saw her for what she was, not what they expected her to be. "Thanks," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Johnson nodded, his face unreadable. Then he turned to leave, but before he did, he gave her one last glance. "You're tougher than they think. Don't let them win." It was a small thing, but it made something inside her click. Maybe she wasn't invisible after all. Maybe she could do this. The next day, the physical training was brutal, as expected. The drills were relentless, pushing the recruits to their limits. But this time, Emily was different. The memory of Corporal Johnson's words echoed in her mind. Don't let them win. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fail. Every drill felt like a battle, but she kept pushing. The others couldn't see it, but she was starting to feel something deep inside her. It wasn't just physical strength. It was something more, something that had been buried under the weight of the mockery and the doubts. As the squad lined up for the last drill, Sergeant Miller walked past them, his eyes cold and critical. "All right, Thompson," he called. "Let's see if you can make it through this one. Don't hold the squad back again." Emily's heart raced. She had no choice but to do her best. The drill was a series of complex maneuvers. One wrong move, and the whole team would be penalized. She had to get it right. The first few steps were shaky. She stumbled on a turn, and her squad mate nearly bumped into her. The others muttered behind her, but she kept going. Her mind was clear now, her movements more deliberate. One step, then another. She wasn't the best, but she was making it. For the first time, she didn't care about the ridicule. She only cared about finishing. By the end of the drill, Emily had done it. She wasn't the fastest, but she was steady. The rest of the squad finished just behind her. There was no applause, no loud cheers, but there was something different in the air. A quiet respect, maybe. Or maybe it was just the fact that she hadn't quit. Not this time. As the group moved back to the barracks, Sergeant Miller pulled Emily aside. The others watched, their attention shifting, but Emily didn't flinch. Miller's eyes were cold, but something was different in his gaze. He was about to speak, but then he paused. For the first time, he seemed to reconsider his words. "You're still not the best," he said, his voice low, "but you're not the worst either." Emily held his gaze, and for the first time since she'd stepped onto the base, she didn't feel like a failure. She didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like a soldier. The squad filed into the barracks, and as Emily stepped inside, she noticed the small shift. The way some of them looked at her now. It wasn't the same. The mockery had softened. and that was enough. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. The tension in the air that day was thick. Emily could feel it as she walked through the barracks, her boots heavy against the floor. It had been weeks since Sergeant Miller had acknowledged her progress, and though the ridicule had softened, it hadn't disappeared completely. She could still hear the whispers behind her back, the laughs that were meant to sting, but she'd grown used to it, or so she thought. That morning during the routine inspection, she had found herself standing in front of Miller again. The usual group of recruits stood around her, half-heartedly going through the motions. The bright fluorescent lights above buzzed in the sterile silence. "Thompson!" Miller's voice cracked the quiet. Emily's heart lurched. Her uniform had been pressed, her boots polished just right, but she still felt like the odd one out. She squared her shoulders, trying to keep the unease from showing. She had learned to stand tall. Even if she was still an outsider in many ways, she wasn't going to let anyone see her doubt. "What's this?" Miller grabbed at the edge of her collar, pulling it down slightly. "Look at this," he said, pulling at the seams. "This looks like a damn mess." Emily felt her face flush, but she stayed silent. She'd made sure everything was in order. He wasn't looking for mistakes this time. He was looking to embarrass her. One of the other recruits, a guy with a buzz cut named Jared, sneered from behind. "She must have used a rusty needle to stitch that." The rest of the group chuckled, as expected, but Emily kept her eyes straight ahead. She didn't flinch. "Fix it," Miller barked, tossing her a pair of scissors. His voice was cold, his eyes glinting with that all-too-familiar disdain. "You think you're just going to get by on looking the part? It doesn't work like that here, Thompson." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Emily's hands shook as she took the scissors, but she didn't dare show it. She walked to the corner, pulling her collar down and fiddling with the fabric, her mind racing. It wasn't the first time she'd been humiliated, but it felt different today, like the walls were closing in. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. It was then that she noticed Corporal Johnson in the back of the room, watching from the doorway. He stood there, arms crossed, his face expressionless. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She didn't know what he was thinking, but the steady presence of his gaze gave her a sense of grounding. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone. After the inspection, the day dragged on. It felt like everyone was waiting for her to break. It was almost like they enjoyed the idea of her faltering. Miller kept his distance, but the quiet mockery from her fellow recruits never stopped. She wasn't just the new kid anymore. She was the weak kid. During lunch, the mess hall felt heavier than usual. The air was thick with the smell of military food, grease, stale bread, and overcooked meat. The sounds of trays scraping against metal were louder today, almost oppressive. Emily sat alone at the corner table, her food untouched. She had learned not to expect any real conversation. They didn't want to hear from someone like her. Still, she tried to ignore the glances and whispers from the others. That's when the unexpected happened. "I've been thinking about yesterday." Johnson's voice came from across the room, drawing Emily's attention. He wasn't speaking loud enough for anyone else to hear, but she could tell he was talking directly to her. Emily raised an eyebrow, confused. He didn't usually engage much with anyone, but there he was, his usual stoic expression softened, just enough for her to notice. "I saw what happened. What Miller said," he continued. "It wasn't right." Emily was stunned. The eyes of the room, full of mockery and silent judgment, seemed to fade into the background. She felt a lump rise in her throat. But before she could respond, he moved away, his departure as quiet as his arrival. He was always brief, but this felt different. It was a moment of quiet understanding. As the day went on, the weight of Miller's ridicule hung over her, but there was something else now too, a spark of defiance. Something had shifted inside her, and she wasn't sure when it had happened. Maybe it was the kindness in Johnson's voice, or maybe it was just the accumulation of everything she had endured that had finally started to build up inside her. Later, during the next drill, things reached a boiling point. The squad had been split into pairs for a combat simulation. Miller paired her with Jared, the guy who had been leading the jokes all along. She could see the smirk forming on his face as they moved into position. "You sure you're up for this?" Jared sneered. "Don't want you getting hurt." Emily didn't respond. She focused on the drill, her mind running through the steps in silence. She wasn't about to let Jared distract her. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of watching her fail. The drill began, and as expected, Jared started throwing jabs, trying to knock her off balance. But Emily was ready. She stepped back, dodging his punches with fluid ease. The others watched, a few snickering at first, but that quickly stopped as they saw her hold her ground. It wasn't just the fight she had won, it was the fact that she had refused to let him break her. She had become stronger than they had ever given her credit for. Then in a moment of unexpected speed, Emily managed to land a quick strike, knocking Jared off balance and sending him stumbling back. The entire squad froze for a second. There was no laughter, no sneers, just shock. Emily stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on Jared, who was now struggling to regain his footing. "Get up," she said, her voice steady, surprising even herself. "We're not done yet." The shift was immediate. The atmosphere in the room changed. Miller's expression shifted from amusement to something harder to read. It was like a wave had swept over the room, leaving silence in its wake. Even Jared seemed to hesitate, caught off guard by the turn of events. It wasn't just the fight, it was the change they hadn't seen coming. Emily wasn't the weak one anymore. She wasn't the joke. She had earned their respect. Her respect. Later that night, after the drill, Miller called her into his office. Emily's heart raced as she walked in. She wasn't sure what he was going to say. The walls were closing in again. She had no idea what to expect. But when Miller spoke, it wasn't what she had expected. His tone was more measured than usual. "You've got something in you, Thompson," he said almost begrudgingly. "I won't pretend I didn't see it today. Don't let it go to your head." Emily stood there, her hands steady at her sides. This wasn't the praise she had been hoping for, but it was a start. The respect she had earned wasn't just from Miller, it was from the whole damn squad. And for the first time, she realized something that changed everything. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone but herself. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. The weeks that followed were different. The mess hall no longer felt like a battleground, and the morning drills didn't seem as impossible. Emily's body was stronger now, faster, more efficient. But it wasn't just her physical strength that had changed. She had learned to stand tall in the face of ridicule, to walk through the fire without letting it burn her down. And it hadn't gone unnoticed. The other recruits started to look at her differently, almost as if they were seeing her for the first time. They didn't laugh anymore when she showed up for drills, and when she finished her sets, no one mocked her. The quiet nods of acknowledgement were subtle, but they were there. She had earned their respect, not through words, but through the way she carried herself, the way she refused to give up. But none of that mattered when Sergeant Miller called her into his office that afternoon. "Private Thompson," he began, his voice lower than usual. "I've been keeping an eye on you. You've made progress. You've earned your place here." It wasn't the praise she had been expecting. Miller wasn't one to give compliments freely, but there was something in his tone that made Emily sit up straighter. "Don't think it's enough," he continued, his gaze intense. "The real test is coming. You'll have to prove yourself again, and again. That's how it works here." Emily felt a knot in her stomach. She had made progress. She had earned respect. But Miller's words hung heavy in the air. Was this really just the beginning? Was she always going to be fighting for approval? "Dismissed," Miller said. The moment over as quickly as it had started. As Emily walked out of the office, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She was used to fighting, used to struggling, but she hadn't anticipated that this battle would never end. Just when she thought she was finally gaining ground, the goalpost kept shifting. Later that day, the squad gathered for a special mission drill. Sergeant Miller stood at the front, his usual swagger replaced by something more calculated. "This is it," he said, his voice hard. "The real test. I'm picking out a leader. The one who shows the most grit will take charge. I'll be watching." Emily's heart raced. A leader. They'd never let her lead. She had barely held on through the basic drills. But now, She had something inside her that refused to back down. She wasn't the weakest anymore. Not in her body, and definitely not in her heart. The mission was intense. The recruits were tasked with navigating an obstacle course, simulating a high-stress combat situation. It wasn't about speed. It wasn't even about skill. It was about who could lead when the pressure was highest. The other recruits scrambled to take charge, barking orders, pushing through with their usual bravado. But Emily stayed calm. She picked her moments, communicating when needed, keeping her team focused. As the drill reached its climax, Emily's squad found themselves trapped at the final obstacle, a simulated ambush. The clock was ticking. Her team was getting frustrated. The pressure was suffocating. But Emily stepped forward, her voice steady, and gave them a simple order. "We move together now." The squad followed, hesitating at first, but trusting her. They cleared the obstacle together, completing the drill. As the final buzzer sounded, Emily stood tall, her chest heaving, sweat dripping down her face. She didn't know if they had won, but she knew one thing. She had led them. Miller walked up to her, his face unreadable. The squad gathered around, all eyes on him. For a moment it felt like everything was suspended in time. "Private Thompson," Miller said, his voice carrying the weight of the room. "You've earned your place here. You've earned my respect." It wasn't much, but for Emily it was everything. She had come from nothing, an outsider, a joke, someone they all thought would quit. But now she had proven them wrong. She had earned her place not through anyone's approval, but through her own actions. And for the first time, as the squad slowly turned to leave, she didn't feel like she was invisible. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She was one of them. The battle wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. As she walked back to the barracks, her shoulders were a little higher. She didn't need anyone to tell her she belonged anymore. She knew it. She had fought for it. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the base. Emily stood at attention, her eyes fixed on the American flag fluttering in the wind. The squad, now in silent formation, stood behind her. They had all seen the change, the transformation that wasn't just about physical strength, but about the heart. The bond had been forged through sweat, struggle, and respect. The distance between her and the rest of them had closed. It wasn't just about the drills or the fights anymore. It was about honor, brotherhood, and resilience. And then, in the quiet of the moment, Sergeant Miller approached. His footsteps were heavy, but his expression was different, respectful even. Without a word, he gave a single nod, one that spoke volumes. It was the kind of nod only earned through true transformation, by proving to the world and to yourself that you belong. The silence held for a beat longer before the squad slowly moved off, but Emily remained, her gaze fixed on the flag. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it didn't matter anymore. She had proven something not just to the others, but to herself. That was all she needed. In life, we all face challenges. Sometimes we're judged before we even get a chance to show who we really are. But as the saying goes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's not about how others see you. It's about how you see yourself when you face the hardest of times. Actions speak louder than words, and in the end, it's the quiet moments of resilience that carry the most weight. This story is about breaking through the noise, standing tall when the world expects you to fall. It's about finding your place in a world that doesn't always understand you, but realizing that your worth is defined by you, not by anyone else. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. If you believe in the power of resilience and brotherhood, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. We're all in this together, and together we rise.